This is a conversation, and I've sort of peeked in when other people, if I'm coming and going, and I saw PowerPoints and I saw footnotes and scholarship, so I hope I don't let you down, but this is billed as a conversation, so I hope to make it informal. I'm really honored to be the third director here at the New York State Writers Institute, the University at Albany. How many of you have been in our offices? Well, you're all invited after this. We've got the most awesome offices, and we're literally like 100 steps right around the corner, and be happy to show you our offices. I came here in 1981 as a graduate student. I came cross-country on the train for 4 days, and I was doing interviews, meeting people, spent a lot of time in the bar car, which is a great place to meet people on the train. But what I do is tell stories, and I listen to people and hear their stories, and I think in a fundamental way that's what we are at the Writers Institute. We invite the world's great writers to come here and tell stories, illuminate truth. We just had an amazing symposium at Page Hall, 30 journalists, editors, scholars. We had 2,500 people there over the course of 2 days. All those panels now live on our website and our Facebook page, so we'd invite you to go back and watch them. We live stream them, and now they're on our Facebook and our website, NYSWritersInstitute.org, and we're getting hundreds of views and some nice engagement and comments, so we hope you'll look at those. There's some really important discussions on race and class, on First Amendment, other issues. But my topic today is on a ghostwriter's and biographer's tale, Spencer Standish and Erastus Corning. Anyone notice the sign on this room? You've probably been here many times. People often don't notice the signs and what things are named for on this campus and elsewhere. And anyone met J. Spencer Standish? He'd like to be called Spencer. Everyone met him? Or Patricia Standish, his wife's name is also on this. So I'll tell you my getting to know Spencer Standish, and this is the book that I'll talk about and read from. So I was a ghostwriter on the book with that term. That term is basically, when you write a book with somebody, it's also sometimes called collaborations. The term comes from ghostwriting because once it's published, you're supposed to disappear. You're really writing the book for someone, with someone. And as a writer, earning my living at the Times Union for 32 plus years and writing books on the side, there were two things that were nice. One, to get an assignment, and even nicer was to get paid at the end of it. Getting paid for your writing is not a dirty word. Write for hire is what I did and what I still do. Professional writers write. And it's always nice when you get a paycheck. So Spencer Standish contacted me, and we had a meeting and asked if I would help him write his book. His main purpose was to leave a history of his family and his business and all his kind of philosophy of life and business for his 5 grandchildren. He died almost a year ago, September 23rd, 2016, at age 91. And I spent a lot of time with Spencer Standish, someone I had not really known before. That book came out in 2009, I think, so he was in his early, mid-80s. And he wanted to kind of think about his life and sum it up. So we spent a lot of time together. And I went to his house a lot. We took rides in the car a lot. We walked through the cemetery where his parents were buried and spent a lot of time with him. And what he was wealthy. And he talked about wealth being both a burden and a great responsibility. And he was the wealthiest person in the capital region for a long time. His net worth was over $200 million, and he gave a lot of it away near the end of his life as a philanthropist, including this room, this beautiful room here, the Standish Room, including 3 endowed professorships at this university, 7-figure gifts to this university. He was also the very first president of the University at Albany Foundation, which is our fundraising arm. I like to say they put the gas in the tank of the Writers Institute and a lot of other organizations, I'm sure the university libraries. So Spencer Standish is a pillar and someone really important to the history and the legacy and the foundation of this university. Fardeen Sinai, who I'm sure you know, the director of development here, knew him early on, and he used to say that Spencer was instrumental in getting other business leaders and other philanthropists and high net worth individuals to come and join him, to come and give and be benefactors of this university. So Spencer Standish grew up in this, we spent a lot of time at what was his childhood home, looking at it, walking around along the river in Rensselaer, very close to what is the Albany Yacht Club, which is another story why it's in Rensselaer. It used to be on the Albany side, but right near there, right near where Fort Craylow is. Do you know Fort Craylow, the historic site? Right along that stretch. And it's a pretty modest house. He liked to remember as a kid, his job was always to get a bucket of water from a well 2 doors down, because there was not indoor plumbing originally when he was a youngster. And he was an only child, and his family was fairly modest, but his father went to Lowell Textile in Lowell, Massachusetts, which was one of the great mill cities of America in the 19th century and early 20th century, kind of fallen on hard times. Jack Kerouac was from Lowell. But he was a blue-collar family. His mother went for a couple years to what was then State Teachers College. So that was sort of the connection why he also wanted to help UAlbany, our predecessor to the State Teachers College. She had to drop out to be a homemaker and to help raise their son, Spencer. I was always looking for, what is the insight, what is the key to who he is? And his professional affiliation was Albany International. You'll see a plaque over there, that's part of it. It started as Albany Felt. At the height in the late 1980s, they had 22 plants in 10 countries around the world, and their business was a multi-billion-dollar business. They were a Fortune 500 company. It's hard to explain, but basically they make large felt sleeves for the paper manufacturing business. So big paper plants have massive rollers and machinery, and they make the felt sleeves that go over it. Sort of think like a fleece that catches all that slurry and water and pulp that becomes paper. Anyway, they dominated that industry. They were the world leader in that industry. And as newspapers started dying, that's something else we took up in our symposium, and as printed books started sliding and people used less paper, became paperless, the business started to recede and decline. And the historic plant, which I walked through with Spencer too, on Menands, this beautiful old, it kind of looks like Mass Mocha, that beautiful old industrial building, has since been sold, and it's now condos. And the headquarters that was in Albany for over 100 years, 120 years, that employed thousands of people here, all went away. It's now up in New Hampshire, and the biggest part of their business and the growing part of their business is polymers, super light materials, kind of like Kevlar, the next generation of Kevlar for the aerospace industry, for airplanes. So we talked a lot about how you have to change as the industry changes around you, but his world was paper manufacturing. But he also inherited wealth, and he wanted this book for his 5 grandchildren who will also inherit wealth. Millions of dollars. They have a family foundation through the community foundation of the Capital Region that gives out several $1 million a year in grants, the Standish Family Foundation, but his grandchildren and his 2 children also inherit a lot of money. And he wanted to impart a lot of lessons that he learned about being a good steward of wealth. I'll give you a couple examples of how frugal he was, and what I really liked about him was how frugal he was. And I didn't get rich on this book, by the way. It wasn't like he was throwing money at me. When he would send me things like notes and different documents and stuff, he would use old envelopes from, at the time, like NYMO or his banking thing. He refused to throw out envelopes that weren't used. He recycled envelopes that came in, junk mail, stuff like. The other thing, I was interviewing his kids a lot, and like, tell me about your father. I said, yeah, he was tough. He was, really, he didn't didn't let us buy a lot of things that we wanted. And one thing he was a stickler on in the refrigerator, and this is what I loved about this guy, the kids would come home and reach in and grab the new thing of milk. And he would always get angry and say, finish that old milk before you open a new one. This was a guy worth $200 million. He also, somebody told me a story that he had a painter come in, just a small general contractor painter that paint in his house. And when he went to present the bill, he was, the richest person in the capital region. Spencer had found in one of the little local papers a 10% off coupon. And he presented it to the guy with his bill and expected 10% off. But the key to his whole sort of philosophy and what you do with great wealth summed up to me in this anecdote he told me when he was a young boy, and I'll just read from the story because it's very interesting and very unusual. Imagine he's 5 years old, he's an only child, and I'll just read this section. At any rate, what I remember about New Year's Day, this is the other thing as a ghostwriter, you're writing in the voice of the person. So you have to really get out of the way and try to understand who this person is. So this whole book is as if Spencer Standish wrote it. At any rate, what I remember about New Year's Day in 1931 says a lot about my family and how I was raised, and it speaks volumes about the foundation of the business leader and philanthropist I would become. My mother, Florence Spencer Standish, had stoked a warm, toasty fire in the living room fireplace by the time that she and my father called me in on New Year's morning and told me to have a seat on the sofa. Other children were probably sleeping in late as their parents may have been nursing hangovers from New Year's Eve parties. I, on the other hand, was about to be given my inaugural financial briefing during our family's annual securities portfolio review. There upon a coffee table, my parents had spread out a ledger book, financial records, stock receipts, tax returns, and other documents, and in particular, the newspaper with the December 31st year-end closing stock prices. With an air of formality, they spoke in adult terms and financial terminology in front of me, despite the fact that I was only in first grade. I was their firstborn, after all, their only child, and the heir destined to inherit what would become their considerable wealth. For the next hour or so, my parents reviewed how their investments had performed in that year, 1931. They discussed their portfolio of stocks, charted their net worth as compared to previous years, and undertook a thorough financial reckoning. Even though my father was a business executive and my mother merely a homemaker, she was a self-taught financial wizard and took control of my parents' investments, a task my father wisely ceded to her. And it goes on from there. He would show me, and again, he would send me documents and things. He got some early, and it goes on each year since he was 5. He got the maximum allowable gift from parents, which was $3,000. His parents were real sticklers about IRS regulations, and he sort of had a Warren Buffett philosophy that you buy really good stocks, blue chip stocks, and you hold them. So he was showing me records of things that his parents had given them since he was 5, 6, 7, in the early 30s, Westinghouse, like original, stocks of Westinghouse and GE and Johnson & Johnson. And also this started as Albany Felt, became Albany International. And he showed how, it's compound interest and how things grow. Stocks split and grow. So his $1,000 worth of Westinghouse stock became worth $500,000. And the same with his Albany International. He didn't sell when things got tough and other people were bailing out and selling, and that thing grew, 50 times, 100 times, 1,100 times his initial investment. And he talked about how you hold, and he learned from his mother. He remembers all these things in his head. She would tell him, waste not, want not. All these sort of things about frugality, and that really stuck with him. And he told me, I'd always say, so Spencer, what advice would you give me and stuff like, live within your means, young man. So he always had a Cadillac, which is a nice luxury car, but it's not a Lamborghini or a Maserati or, a lot of people with his kind of worth have all these exotic cars. No, he always had a Cadillac. It was not brand new, He had a very nice house, but it wasn't over the top. So live within your means was a really important lesson. The other thing, when you're ghostwriting a book, you know, you're hired by someone, and he had final say. He could have taken anything out that he wanted, but it was really amazing that he left a lot of things in. I mean, he left everything in. I don't think he ended up taking everything out, including the story of his first wife leaving him for the tennis instructor at Schuyler Meadows Club, where he had the big mansion on the third hole of the golf course, a quarter mile up the road, and he left that in. It was really crushing for him, but he wanted this to be a truthful document. But here's one story that I like that he tells. I remember one Halloween in the mid-1930s. I was 11 or 12. We had a lot of freedom as kids in that era. Our parents let us roam far and wide across Rensselaer trick-or-treating, all without supervision. I was with my buddies in the upper part of the city, and we came across a pile of used tires next to a garage, which was closed for the night. One of our gang, remember it wasn't I, came up with the brilliant plan of swiping the tires and rolling them down a steep hill. This was a typical bit of Halloween mischief. We let go of the tires, they picked up speed, and they crashed into the Rensselaer police station at the bottom of the hill. Our tires also knocked over a couple of the police motorcycles parked in front of the station. Luckily, neither the motorcycles nor the police station suffered any serious damage, and the Halloween prank blew over with none of us getting caught, thus avoiding any potential disaster. And he goes on. This is what I really respect him for. I mean, this was his memoir, and it was self-published, but I mean, it's sold in bookstores around here, but it was really for he gave it out to all the shareholders and employees of Albany International. He gave it out to his grandchildren. He kept things like this in. I'd like to be able to report that the tire rolling event on Halloween night was the end of my bad adolescent behavior, but it was not. He also went to Albany Academy, got in some trouble there. My father generally left the discipline to my mother, except under unusual circumstances. I can recall 2 such times. They are memorable because they were the only times I received the strap from my father. As was common for that time, he kept a thick leather strap in the bathroom with which he sharpened the straight razor he used for shaving. The strap was heavy, dark brown leather, and it connected with my backside with a loud thwap as my father, on those 2 instances, swung it hard enough to leave a welt. The pain followed a few seconds after the frightening sound. It stung like the worst sunburn you could imagine and raised tears in my eyes. I was probably 9 or 10 years old the first time my dad took the strap to me. I don't recall what provoked him, but I was angry at my mother for some reason. I think she kept telling me to do something, perhaps a chore, and I kept saying I wasn't going to do it. I finally exploded in a rage and slapped her with my open hand. I remember the look of shock and fear, followed by her tears and a scream that caused my father to come rushing to her side. In those few seconds before he arrived, I had already backed off and crumpled to the floor in a heap of remorse over what I had done to my mother and worry over what was to follow. My father was quiet, a man of few words. He didn't need to say anything. He motioned with his head upstairs. I followed him in silence to the bathroom. He got out his razor strap, bent me over, and told me to grab my knees. I didn't resist. I heard the whistle of the strap a split second before the smack, followed by the intense burn and pain in my rear end. I'm embarrassed to have to relate this incident, but it happened, and I won't deny it. It also made a lasting impression, something I'll never forget for as long as I live. I think the story is also important to share because this is meant as a full and honest portrait, even the unflattering parts. I will say that I never raised my hand to my mother again. I was ashamed that I did it even that one time, but it taught me a lesson about anger management and restraint that has proven invaluable as I grow older. And it goes on from there. But his mother was the one, even though his father was an engineer and really learned and brought Albany Felt and Albany International to the top of that industry, it was his mother who was the real quiet strength and the work ethic and the morality and ethics behind everything that he did. I'll read this short passage about his mother, which was interesting for her time. She was ahead of her time in certain ways. Very traditional, left college to be a homemaker, but also ahead of her time in ways. While I was growing up, my mother taught me lessons that have stuck with me my entire life. Some of those life lessons may have been imparted at church, though because it was my mother who took me to church, my father only occasionally attended. And in my mind, what I learned from my mother and from the Methodist Church seemed to merge. My mother's teachings grew out of the quaint British aphorisms she delivered to me over the course of my childhood, adolescence, teen years, and even into adulthood. They expressed the rock-ribbed pragmatism and commitment to conservative spending practices and living within her means, all principles I still believe continue to espouse to my own children, grandchildren, friends, and business associates. With my father's support and reinforcement, my mother taught me that absolute honesty, integrity, and ethics were critical. At the same time, she taught me to take care of my financial affairs. The idea of borrowing money was not something my parents would ever do, in normal circumstances, that is. He goes on to talk about their parents bought 2,000 shares of Albany Felt early on, that was way beyond what they could afford, and it was selling for $65 a share in 1944. Part of the struggle with the industry, I think it's down to maybe $30 a share now, and it's not doing well as a company, but they had to borrow $160,000 in 1944. And he remembers it the only time that they went into debt, but that stock then multiplied, turned into millions of dollars. But I'll end with these rules, these kind of principles that he really wanted. This was his favorite part of the book, the epilogue, his suggestions for success to his grandchildren who will inherit substantial amounts of money. Number one, stick together. Since I grew up as an only child and I had just 2 children of my own, we're a relatively small family. That's why I consider it important that you stick together. And he goes on, be stewards of your wealth. You are blessed with a solid financial foundation. Live within your means. Make the family wealth grow, and so that your children will also inherit solid financial foundation and freedom. Always be honest and truthful. Remember my mother's favorite expression, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we venture to deceive. I'm proud that we built our family's wealth in an honest fashion. We don't need to lie, cheat, steal, or engage in any other dishonorable activities. Give back to your community. Do your part to make the community in which you live a better place for others less fortunate than yourselves. Be a parental role model. Set a good example for your children. Always strive to do your very best. Don't spoil your children. Number 7, resist the urge to indulge their every whim and to buy them whatever they want. And this reminds me of a story he told me. He actually did. He had a nice house in Loudonville, and he built a house for his daughter next door, and then had a lot of land, and she had horses and things. But her kids, I think she had 3 kids. Anyway, they wanted a pool table. And a nice pool table is expensive. I don't know, they're $5,000 to $10,000. And of course, they came to their grandfather next door. Come on, Grandpa, we want a pool table. He did some calculation. He said, well, I will buy you the pool table under the condition this represents a pooling of all your gifts. This Christmas and birthdays for the next 3 years, there will be no gift if you want the pool table. And they thought it over and kind of mulled it over, and the kids said, yeah, we want that, Grandpa. Okay. And he did not give them a Christmas or birthday present for the next 3 years. He was that kind of, he was all about lessons in that. You don't just give them everything they need. And number 8, stick together, and don't spoil your children. But he was really an interesting person, very kind of shy, a little socially awkward, but he did a lot of good with his wealth, and it's still doing a lot of good. There is this family foundation that spins off the principal of the interest and doesn't touch the principal, and I think they give out anywhere from $2 to $3 million a year in different things. And I know they continue to fund some things here at the university through that foundation. I guess I'll talk now about Corning, because that's the other half of this. And this wasn't a ghostwriting project. This was a biography on my own. The first book I did, and it came out 20 years ago, 1997. And since we have librarians here, I do want to say I really respect and honor the work of librarians, especially archivists, because I've done so many stories and books that rely on these preserved histories, and they're really important. I did a book on Teddy Roosevelt. I got to work in the Houghton Library at Harvard. World-class library. And, I wasn't a big shot, but it didn't matter. It's open to the public, so I stopped working Mondays at the Times-Union. I worked 4 days a week so I could work on my book projects and other things, other writing. So I would email Sunday the director of the Theodore Roosevelt papers. They moved them from the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace on East 18th by Gramercy Park because they didn't feel they could give them proper, humidity and climate control, and they weren't well preserved, and there wasn't a full-time staff there, so they moved them to the Houghton Library. An incredible collection. So I would email, say, hey, can you get me boxes, 86 to 99 for Monday, and I'll be there. And I drove over early. I got there when the doors opened at 9 o'clock, and I'd stay all the way till they closed at 5. And you could eat off the floor in the Houghton Library. And there were other people coming, first edition Shakespeare folios and scholars from around the world. But what he brought out for me on that cart every Monday were Theodore Roosevelt's original letters. Throughout his life, he wrote to his big sister, Bammy, and she saved him through a lot of trials and tribulations. And when he went into a deep depression after his wife and mother died within 24 hours on Valentine's Day, she sort of pulled him through, and she was always his rock. And he wrote her religiously every Sunday from the time he was a teenager to the time of his death. He died young at 60. But all these letters were preserved and archived at the Houghton Library. And I got this arc of his life in his words to his big sister. She saved all those letters. And some of them were stained with, he wrote them out on the trail, on camping trips, some crazy adventures and things, but they were all his original letters, and that was an incredible gift, thanks to a lot of librarians and archivists. But the Corning book, the Albany Institute of History and Art got the Corning family papers, and I didn't really know what I was getting into, and I said, I'd like to come and look at the Corning family papers. So I came, and it was a room, probably from about where the camera is here, floor to ceiling of boxes. Had to be 500 boxes, and I just my heart sank. It's like, oh my God, am I going to die here? So then I kind of recovered, and I looked around, and I could see some of them were marked EC2, Erastus Corning II. It turns out the Cornings were pack rats, and a lot of the boxes were financial documents of the founding and the creation of the New York Central Railroad, which his grandfather put together from a lot of little small railroads and things. So I said, okay, I don't really need to focus on those. Just look at those EC2, and I sort of got them all to separate them, and they really filled like a corner, and there were about 90 of them. So that's what I started with, and that was became the spine of this book, going through all those boxes. But the other great thing was the newspaper, the Albany Times-Union, had an old-fashioned clipping service. We used to have 3 full-time librarians, all of whom had degrees from the University of Albany in library sciences. And each day of the paper, they would have big scissors, and they would clip articles and file them according to topic, or name, and sometimes cross-reference them like an index. And those grew and grew and grew over, 100 years. And they were in little manila envelopes, clipped, not great preservation-wise, but the actual physical newspaper. And I went and looked under Erastus Corning II, and the files were about as wide as my arm. Each of those little manila envelopes stuffed with articles of his 42 years as mayor. So I started going through and reading those, and there was a lot of information. Then I started doing interviews. I did 250 plus interviews of people who were his political cronies, who went to World War II with him, his classmates from Groton, class of 1928, his classmates from Yale, class of 1932, everybody I could get to. And I got to this project late, and as I'm working on it, I'm reading the obituaries like, wow, thank God I interviewed that judge 2 months ago or something. People were dying, and the story was being lost as I was working on it. And I decided to do it after I spent a day, did a long profile on Betty Corning, who was the mayor's widow. And she was actually on oxygen at the time. They were both heavy smokers, and both she and the mayor have died of emphysema. So I started working on it, and luckily, I got to the people I needed to, and all the documents were there. But the point of my talk was, do you know why the Corning Tower is named the Corning Tower? All right, I'm going to tell you. So Erastus Corning II, who was this family of very wealthy political figures and industrialists. So his great-grandfather, the original Erastus, founded the New York Central Railroad, as I said. His grandfather, it always kind of skips a generation. His grandfather had fun blowing through the fortune. He basically spent them back to zero. He raised orchids, he had racehorses, he had this huge farm down in Glenmont, Corning Hill Road. He had 600 acres, and he was basically just having fun spending like a drunken sailor. And then his father, the next generation, had to earn it back. And his father was the president, CEO, head of Ludlam Steel, which was a steel plant down the hill on Spring Street from Siena down in what's Watervliet. And it was a big steel manufacturing plant. And then that kind of eventually, long after he had died, it's now out of business. So his father was a steel guy. His father was also the lieutenant governor under Al Smith, and he was being groomed to be governor. And Al Smith was running for president. This was 1928, and Erastus, his father's name rather, was Edwin Corning, was all groomed. He was the chair of the the Democratic Party of New York State. He was lieutenant governor. He was Al Smith's hand-picked successor. And he had a heart attack on a train coming back from New York, and he had to drop out and couldn't serve. And the party was kind of in a panic because it was getting up to election time, and they kind of looked around, who can we get? And somebody suggested, this young guy, he's kind of untested, but he's been in the Senate. He's down from, Dutchess County. He's kind of from a patrician family. And they scrambled, and for Corning's father's replacement, they got Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Corning used to like to say, our family changed the course of history, because when his father had a heart attack, they scrambled and they got FDR. And obviously he was one of our great presidents and great figures in American history. But the Corning family was really interesting. His uncle, Parker Corning, was an 8-term congressman, and he ran, before the Standishes got involved, Albany Felt, which became Albany International. So there's Albany, instead of 6 degrees of separation, I think it's really 1 or 2 degrees. So the Corning family and the Standish family were very intertwined. So anyway, the connection to Mario Cuomo, and he gave me a nice blurb. I'll tell you why I got connected to Mario. I wrote about him for the Times-Union, but there was another story behind that. So Mario was running for governor early on, and he wasn't getting much support. He used to like to joke, nobody whose name ends in a vowel will be elected governor. In other words, he felt it was he was being held back because of his ethnicity. And there were a lot of old-fashioned politicians who were afraid to back him. He was he'd worked in the Court of Appeals. He had been Secretary of State. He wasn't very well known, and he came up to Albany. He had a meeting with Erastus Corning. And at that time, Erastus Corning was a big deal in the state and in the Democratic ranks. And Corning took a liking to him because he knew Cuomo was really smart, was a great orator. And early on, he endorsed him and got out front politically and risked some political capital to say, hey, I'm for Mario. Before the whole stuff with Ed Koch, and Koch was belittling Albany right around that time. So he was an early supporter of Mario Cuomo. And in politics, loyalty is everything. The fact that he would take a risk and get behind his early candidacy when nobody knew him, he had strikes against him because of his ethnicity, Corning backed him, and he always remembered that and did whatever he could later on when he became governor. And my connection to Mario Cuomo, in addition to interviewing him and interviewing his family members, we had an annual tradition where the press would play the governor in softball and basketball. We were always crummy. We didn't have good athletes, and he would always take it so seriously. He was so competitive. He would get state troopers. He would get young guys, really great athletes, and they'd always crush us. And it was kind of demoralizing, but we kept doing it because, you want to be friends with the governor. You want him to call you back and get an interview. So, but one year we put together this ragtag team for basketball. We used to play in this was going back, the Page Hall Gym, which is pretty much decrepit now. I don't think anyone goes down there, but this is where this game took place in probably, I guess, the late 1980s. Anyway, I was on the team, and we were getting crushed. We were down maybe 20 at halftime, and one of the young, really bright, athletic young players was Chris Cuomo, the big TV star now. He's got a new series coming up in CNN and everything, and he was like a senior at CBA, a really athletic kid, really strong, and I had to guard him. I was like, oh man, he was beating me all day. And for some reason, our shots started dropping. We came back and clawed back from this big deficit in the second half, and at the buzzer, I hit the winning shot over Christopher Cuomo. Now I'll tell you how this works. This was my one entree to Mario Cuomo, why he would always call me or call me back. So he would always have a party for the press afterwards at the governor's mansion, beer and hot dogs and hamburgers, and we'd sit around. He was fun. He would tell stories, and those of us who'd played, the reporters would hang out. And that night, we were all sitting there, laughing and having fun, and he was like, where's Christopher? He said, oh, he's so upset. He won't come down from his bedroom because I hit the winning shot over him. So for the next 20, 30 years, whatever it was, if I called him, and when he was down at the law firm in New York, it was within a second I'd call. I was like, yeah, this is Paul Grondahl from the Times Union. He's like, on the line. Grondahl, you still playing basketball? You beat us that day. We want a rematch. And that was the way he was. So every time, that was the one thing that gave me entree to him. So he gave me a nice blurb for the book, and I could always call him on different stories and things. But I'm getting to the part of why the Corning Tower is named the Corning Tower. And let me get to that. Okay. The one building, and there's a lot of backstory, I can't get into it, there's a whole chapter on it. Corning and Rockefeller were both blue bloods. They knew each other from Maine. I spent a lot of time in Northeast Harbor where both their families were, and I saw the Corning family compound, which had sold, and the Rockefeller family compound. And they had both known each other from the country club there. It was called the Tennis and Yacht Club. Anyway, Rockefeller went to Dartmouth, Corning went to Yale. They're roughly the same age. They'd see each other in the summer, from the same social class. So when I came to the South Mall, the Empire State Plaza, Rockefeller knew he didn't have the money, even great Rockefeller money, to get that built. It turned out to be $2 billion, which in the late 1960s was an absurd sum. Biggest government complex ever built. And they would do battle, and I went through all of Corning's papers, and in the early boxes when Rockefeller was proposing this, and a lot of people were against it, all the files he marked as Brasilia. he called it Rockefeller's sort of outlandish, absurd, Brasilia ego trip. And he was against it for a long time until he saw he couldn't win. And he also benefited personally from the insurance. He had an insurance business, Albany Associates, Mayor Corning did, where anyone who came to Albany and wanted to do business in Albany went through his insurance business. And he carried a lot of the policies on the construction of the mall. So he personally enriched himself. But when he couldn't outmaneuver Rockefeller, they sort of worked together because these were prep school Ivy League boys from Maine. And publicly they clashed, but behind the scenes they put this plan together. And according to Corning, it was a kind of a lease buyback scheme where the Albany County would actually hold the paper and float the bonds to build the Empire State Plaza. So the state was really the tenant of Albany County for the 40 years, 30 or 40-year bonds matured. And I'll describe that in a minute. But Corning likes to say that because he was very good at math, and for most of the 42 years he was mayor, it was a joke. There was no open hearings on budget. You'd say, well, where's the budget, Mayor? He'd pull out an envelope with his scribblings on the back, and he was the king of Albany. So he came up with this financing scheme, and he used to like to say, Nelson took to it like a trout rising to a fly. So he always thought he was smarter than Rockefeller, and Rockefeller was dyslexic. Joe Persico, his speechwriter, who was the late great historian, a good friend of mine, his papers are here in the archives. He would always talk about how Rockefeller hated reading one of his speeches because he would always get messed up. So normally he'd just kind of look at it and then speak extemporaneously. But anyway, Corning and Rockefeller battled over this 98 acres that became the Empire State Plaza. And I'll read this section here. The one building giving a name that has stuck in 1997 belongs to Corning, which happens to be the tallest structure between Montreal and New York City, Corning Tower, and therein hangs a tale. In weak, shaky handwriting from his Boston hospital bed 2 months before his death, Mayor Corning took notes from his stalwart assistant Bill Keefe regarding negotiations for naming the South Mall's tallest building. Corning's notes: Governor talking with group, what are we going to do for Erastus? Dick Connors said Corning was tall, why not the tower? McNulty, that was Jack McNulty, the congressman, also mentioned it. Cuomo looked out the window at the tower thinking, tall in negotiations, consulted Betty first. Connors sponsors in the Assembly, Anderson in the Senate. Chapter 6, Laws of 1983, passed March 14th and signed on the 15th. In an interview, Governor Mario Cuomo recounted these details. The mall was very important to Mayor Corning. We did a lot of work to get the bill exactly right, Cuomo said. The mayor regarded the mall as his triumph. Some others saw it as Rocky's triumph, but it didn't matter. We worked it out with Paulie Noonan and Bill Keefe and Dick Connors and Jack McNulty in the Assembly and Andy, Senate Majority Leader Warren Anderson in the Senate. Hospitalized in Boston with chronic lung ailments and other complications, Corning was too ill to attend Cuomo's bill signing ceremony on March 15th, 1983 in the governor's ceremonial Red Room on the second floor of the Capitol. His wife Betty attended, as did Senate Majority Leader Warren Anderson, etc. An unusual guest who did not normally attend such public events was Cuomo's wife, Matilda, who had befriended both Erastus and Betty Corning. After signing the bill into law, officially naming the building Corning Tower, Cuomo said, Mayor Corning's place as an institution is not just in the city of Albany, but in the entire state of New York. Mayor Corning literally towers above us all now. Cuomo said, Mayor Corning has devoted his entire adult life to the people of this state, to public service. His dedication, his devotion to the city and state that he so loves have blazed a trail with those of us in public service would do well to follow. And it goes on. My point was that even though Rockefeller's full name is on it, the Governor, Nelson A. Rockefeller Plaza, etc., everyone calls it the South Mall if they're from here, or just the Empire State Plaza or Plaza. You don't hear that. It's not like Rockefeller Center in New York. Nobody calls it Rockefeller Plaza. So the only name that resonates, you got Agency Building 1 or 2 or 3, and you've got the Egg, which isn't a real name. and you've got the State Museum, but you've got the Corning Tower. So my point is, the Corning Tower is common usage today to designate the tallest building of the plaza. Only rarely is one here Rockefeller's name attached to it. And the Corning Tower observation deck, where more than 250,000 visitors gaze down on Albany each year, is located on the 42nd floor, one floor for each year Corning was mayor. From boyhood sailing and sporting competitions in Maine to the marble monolith of the largest state government complex ever built in this country, even as he lay dying in Boston while the governor signed Corning Tower into law, Albany's mayor for life had topped his old rival Rockefeller once more. In death as in life, it would seem, Corning had, quote, and this was a direct quote, up in his place in Maine in the outhouse, Corning kept a picture of Rockefeller. And he always liked to say, when it came down to the South Mall, and he knew he couldn't get the financing without the mayor and things, he said, I had Nelson by the balls. And he said that often, so he said, I had Nelson by the balls one last time. And Corning will retain that grip until the year 2004, when Albany County's term as the state's landlord is up, and the state retains official ownership of the South Mall. That official deed transfer will come after city and county receive tens of millions of dollars in payments from the state in lieu of lost taxes. That transition, year 2004, will be about the time that the deteriorating Mammoth Marble complex will require untold millions of dollars in renovations, no doubt paid for by state money, not city or county coffers. And the spirit of the rascally Erastus will be smirking atop Corning Tower, knowing he beat Nelson at the political game in perpetuity. So that epic story of the South Mall had a lot of, deep history with Corning and Rockefeller, and the Standish name too. These kind of really important sterling names around Albany have a lot of resonance and a lot of stories behind them if you're interested in hearing them and if you dig a little bit. And the key is to preserve these records. I love being on the same floor as our archives here at the University of Albany, because what you do is really important. You make it possible for biographers and historians and other storytellers to tell those stories. So thank you very much.